Go.
Welcome to the PRCA's podcast Fuse, the global podcast for PR, marketing and comms professionals. Our special guest is Mark Lowe. Welcome, Mark.
Hi.
So I'm going to start off with just explaining a little bit about your background, Mark, for our community. So Mark co-founded Third City in 2011, building it into one of UK's best-known independent PR agencies. In his 25 years career, he has advised senior clients from a broad range of sectors across tech, healthcare, and FMCG. He's a regular commentator on brand and reputation, and recently sustainability. He writes regularly for the PR Week, appears on Sky News and the BBC. In 2019, he completed the Goldman Sachs course for entrepreneurs. He's a trustee of several charities and has even founded a free school in northwest London. Now, Mark, my God, that is a lot that you are sort of operating across. Can you explain to us just what a typical day in your life looks like?
Yeah, my life's changed a lot in the last 5 years. I suppose a lot of people's have. One of the things that really was a major change for me is that I had a son who's 6 years old. And also, sort of during COVID, we were a moving out of London family. So I had lived in London for 25 years. I went to university there, so I was a real naturalised Londoner. And I actually moved down to Hove 3 years ago. So in terms of the way that I split my week nowadays, I have 3 days in London. So I have my office days and then I have my home days. My office days are very much focused on the commute, what I can learn when I'm doing the commute. And then when I'm in the office is actually meeting people, being face-to-face with the team, being face-to-face with clients and others. My home days are a little different. That's when I tend to focus more on well-being and also on tasks that I have to do on my own, like writing decks, documents, articles, things like that. Also, that's when I get the opportunity to spend a bit more time with my son and also with my wife, who has a senior comms job and spends a lot of time in London as well. So it's a nice split the week. My Mondays and my Fridays are down here in Hove, and then I have those 3 days in London during the week.
That's so lovely. And, you know, there were so many families that did move out of London, and actually quite a few of them also moved back. But it's incredible that you've made it work for you, which is, you know, the best of both worlds. Now, with PR people, we constantly have to keep an eye on what's happening in the news, especially when we're focused on sort of external stakeholders. And it's become so difficult for so many of us to constantly keep up with the news, you know, in addition to the sort of, you know, the mental health aspect, because there's a lot of negativity always in the news. How do you consume your news? What sort of safeguards do you have? So, you know, it could be a full-time job, actually just keeping up with the news. So how do you approach finding that balance, and what sort of outlets do you listen to, and what advice do you have for others in PR who need to keep on top of the news, but also have so much else going on in their life?
I think one of the things that I've done that's also changed in my life is I've really moved away from short form, well, social media generally, and short form social media in particular. So I used to be on Twitter a lot. I still find it useful for getting information, but I don't really participate anymore. I'm much more now interested in long form journalism. I think it's sad that we all moved away from it, actually, and I think many of us are gravitating back towards it. The only social media platform I'm on is LinkedIn, which I find really valuable for business networking. Beyond that, then, in terms of the media I consume, I'm a subscriber to The Times, to The Economist and the FT, so that's where I get my current affairs news. I am interested in sports and writing about sports, so I also am a subscriber to The Athletic. And for sort of big ideas, I'm also a big fan of the LRB, the London Review of Books, which I read when I can. I'm also a major consumer of podcasts, and that's actually one of the biggest ways that I've learned. I've learned through my career as I've got older that actually auditory learning is really useful for me, and in some ways a better way of learning for me than reading. And the other good thing for me with podcast consumption, I know it's typical of men my age, is that I can integrate it with exercise as well. And well-being and exercise is something that have become really important to me as well.
I imagine, and also your commute going from London to Hove as well, that probably gives you some time to really take into you know, the whole podcast listening as well as others. Now, looking back at your career, would you say that you have an overarching sort of, purposeful approach to your career, things that you're attracted to? I mean, we'll talk later on, obviously, about the sort of aspects to your career in terms of the ESG, sustainability, and B Corp. But would you say that there's been an overarching purpose, in your career? What's driving the decisions that you make and the direction that your business has been going in?
Well, I tended to always do things on instinct, to follow my heart and to do what I love doing. I would always recommend to people that that is primarily what they do. If you can enjoy what you do for a job, then you're going to be in the top 5% of the population, because the vast majority of people don't. And in that sense, I'm really lucky. I love what I do. In terms of a career path, I would say that I wasn't as well planned as other people were. Certainly in my 20s, I tried out a lot of different things. I think partly that was because I was interested in a lot of different things, and I didn't really sort of get things together to get a serious job, really. My first agency, until I was 28, 29. So in my 20s, I did a lot of different things. I had a lot of different experiences. In many ways, I think that was valuable for me. In some ways, more valuable than maybe a more structured career path. Certainly not something for everyone, but that's kind of how I approached it. In terms of an overarching mission for life, I went to Goldsmiths, which is a brilliant place, great institution. And the motto there was lifelong learning. And that is something that I've really tried to take into my life as well. I'm always looking to learn, not just from books and listening to podcasts and reading and experiencing things and travel, but also from talking to people. And one of the things that I'm very lucky with, I'm quite an outgoing person, and I feel very lucky that in my work environment, I get to work with people of all different ages, generations, and lots of different backgrounds. And obviously in my home life, I've learned a lot from having a son. I had him a bit older than a lot of dads, and he's a real philosopher and makes me think very differently about life and gives me always a fresh perspective. So his perspective, and also my wife's, is something that I really value.
I really love that. I mean, the advice is to follow your enthusiasm, where your curiosity leads you. And you're right, it does actually end up being a really good driver for success, because if you're interested and enthusiastic about something, and then it doesn't feel like work, it feels like play, and you give it sort of 100%. I also love the lifelong learning mission as well, and particularly how much we can learn from other people, particularly if you're an active listener. And I've known you obviously, for quite a while, and I've always noticed that you really tune into people when you speak to them, because I think so many times we lose the opportunity to learn from others because we're just thinking about what we're going to say next, rather than really understanding that person and understanding the insight that they can share. Now, studying
Can I add something on that, actually, is that don't mean to interrupt, is that I have learned that. So I was never a good listener. I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily a good listener now, but I believe that listening is a good thing. So I try to do it. And as I've got older, I've realized that you learn a lot more from listening than you do from talking, although I'm naturally a person that wants to talk.
What advice would you give to our listeners on how to be a better listener? What have you learned?
Interestingly, well, one of the things, actually, I was just talking to you about this off camera as well. I actually, because I've done so much, been in so many loud environments in my life, I've actually just got hearing aids. And that's obviously enabling me to hear better, which is really interesting. It's really widened my world. I've only had them for about a couple of weeks, so I'm really getting used to that. But it also has made me think a lot about what the difference is between hearing and listening. If you can hear things properly, that enables you to listen, but just because you're hearing doesn't necessarily mean that you're listening. And I'm always trying to now, not always succeeding, because, as I say, I like to express myself. I've always had a tendency to interrupt, not out of, I hope not out of rudeness, but just a tendency to sort of want to express myself or to say the next thing. But actually, I've learned a lot from trying to listen and absorb what people say. And in what we do, that's really, really important, because, of course, you're managing people all the time. And if you can understand their motivations, the best way to do that is by actually not just hearing what they say, but listening to what they say.
Absolutely. And also listening in terms of it's not always audible. So much of language is nonverbal, and just tuning in so that you can see the facial expressions, body language, and so forth. So yeah, I definitely find that fascinating. Your sort of initial interest was acting, music, songwriting. Do you feel that coming from a creative background has really helped you in your career as a PR and also in leadership?
I would certainly say in terms of the practice of PR, it helps. And I think there are a lot of people who work in public relations that have creative backgrounds. And if you do, I mean, for instance, our managing director, Susie, has a background as a professional musician. I think that those skills are really helpful to bring into the workplace when you come to work in PR. I think I saw this diagram, this sort of Venn diagram once that Rory Sutherland drew, which is on one side of it is things that are creative, and on the other side of it are things that you can earn money from. And I think in the Venn diagram, PR is one of those areas where it crosses between the two, because obviously pursuing a purely creative career, I've got great admiration for people that do it. But having tried it a few times when I was younger, I realized just how hard that is. And I think PR is something that allows you to bring together a lot of different interests. And if you're quite curious and interested in different things, I tend to characterize my approach as almost like interdisciplinary. I'm really interested in the connections between things. I see all things as being connected. And PR has really allowed me to bring together a lot of my different interests in politics, in music, in creativity. And I think it's one of the few careers that really lets you do that. And I think that's what's great about it.
I agree. And you studied American politics at sort of master's level. I wanted to just pull that thread. Did you sort of deduce from studying American politics that it is so different from UK politics? And obviously, this year is election year where, both UK and US have elections. What sort of differences did you sort of glean? And did you decide to learn about American politics rather than the UK because it's just much more extra and more performative and more interesting in many ways?
I was interested in it because of the time when I was studying it. So it was around 2002, 2003. I was quite interested and involved in things like the anti-globalization movement at that point. I was involved in the Iraq war protests. And I saw that a lot of people would speak about politics, and particularly American politics would have a view on it. But I wanted to gain a better understanding of it. So that was the reason that I studied it. But actually, I've taken many of the learnings from that have been really helpful to me in the last 15, 20 years. Obviously, the learnings of studying and thinking about politics, but also obviously with the outsized role that American politics plays in our lives has made that, I think, a really valuable exercise for me, actually sitting down and studying it and reading about it. In terms of US politics versus UK politics, obviously UK politics affects me much more directly. And there are times I do feel I'm not a full-time professional political operative, but we do a lot of work in the agency which is adjacent to politics or policy. So having a knowledge of politics is obviously always useful. I quite like the distance that I have in not being a lobbyist or being in public affairs or being in the world of Westminster, to observe it really as a fan, I suppose, or as someone that's interested. I do find that British politics tends to be a bit more parochial. I was heavily involved and interested in it in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum for the last kind of couple of years. Obviously, at the moment, American politics is in a period where it's very visible to all of us. And I think it draws bigger pictures. It has huge drama. It borrows from sort of American cultural dominance and or it has an almost cinematic quality, which I think you don't get from politics in other countries. And I think that's what makes it so magnetic and so interesting. But it was certainly studying it gave me really a new perspective as well. It's something I'm still passionate about.
And I think whether people are in consumer, PR, corporate, at the end of the day, so many sort of decisions increasingly, whether you're from a consumer perspective, is actually, also, the consumers take into consideration sort of geopolitics and stances and in the rise of activism in consumer decision making. So I completely agree. I think understanding politics is key, not only for those working in public affairs, but across communications. Now, many people have such interesting stories about how they first entered into the industry. And so many people actually sort of fell into the industry, didn't quite know what they wanted to do, and then ended up sort of discovering it. I wanted to know about how you first discovered the world of public relations and how you got your first role at an agency, which I believe is Republic and now is MHP.
That's right. That was back in the late 90s. So I'm demonstrating how old I am. I went to Goldsmiths, as I said, which is a university where most of the people who came out of there went into the media. And I knew that I wanted to go into the media. I didn't really know what that meant. I spoke to a few people and decided that I would go for jobs in journalism and publishing and in public relations and advertising. And I went to loads of interviews and I took the first job I got, which happened to be in a PR agency. So in that sense, I fell into it accidentally. I was always interested in the media, so I knew I'd probably end up in a media career.
And then your 20s, you had the most incredible time in working in different fields. And then you also did a lot of freelance work as well across multiple agencies, which must have given you most incredible vantage point of understanding what sort of culture you want to sort of create when you set up your own agency, what sort of work you want to do. And that vantage point then led you to set up Third City. And I wanted to ask, what does it mean, Third City? And what made you decide to set up your PR firm with your co-founder?
So quite a lot of questions there. I'll do a slight rewind on the sort of how we ended up starting Third City, because I was 33 when we started it. I had done a lot of different things in my 20s, including studying politics, including being involved in music, creativity. Actually, was also, it happened to me, trying out all those things happened at opportune time because it was also a dot-com boom. So there was a lot of work around in PR. So I freelanced at a lot of different agencies. I also did a period working in brand strategy on Unilever brands, which was really interesting. I went to South America actually to do that. So that gave me an insight into thinking about brands as well, and actually thinking about brands and how they might impact in other cultures. So I did those things. I finished the master's degree. I got to the age of 28 and I thought, right, I really need to get a proper job. I went to a lot of agencies to try to get a job, and I was lucky enough to end up at Bannon Brown, which was a great agency. And I was able to work with people who gave me the opportunities that I needed and that I found really interesting and inspiring. And those are the people that I still work with. So there are 4 or 5 of us still at Third City who go back more than 15 years. So that's left a real imprint, the DNA of that agency on us. In terms of the reason that we left, I mean, I was pretty entrepreneurial. When I was younger, I started a PR agency when I was 24. Obviously didn't have a clue what I was doing. I don't know whether I had a clue what I was doing when we started Third City at 32, but luckily I was surrounded by people that did. But it has been an interesting journey. In terms of why we set up the agency, we had an opportunity and some investment. So we were at a point, it was just after the coalition government came in 2010. There was a lot of change at the agency we were working at. We felt we wanted to do our own thing. I'd always felt that was an ambition. I'm quite an autonomous person. I'm not brilliant at being a company man, I don't think. I never felt that comfortable in really corporate environments. Possibly would feel more comfortable now. But certainly back in those days, that wasn't really something I wanted to do. I wanted to determine my own future. So obviously in that sense, being an entrepreneur really suited me. So from my perspective, that was the motivation, but also the opportunity arose. And I do believe that when an opportunity arises, you need to just take it. So that's what we did.
And I was reading up about Third City and this wonderful story about Florence. And I think it's so interesting how people name their agencies and correct me if I'm wrong, but the whole sort of naming of Third City was tied to Renaissance Florence because it wasn't the most powerful or biggest city of the medieval period, but it was the most influential from an intellectual and cultural perspective. And it was this great article in PR Week where that was the inspiration that inspired you to call it Third City. And I thought that was really an interesting way because it's about influence and relational capital as opposed to just economic and military might. So in essence, soft power. You were attracted to the soft power of Florence, and is that the sort of the true origin behind the name?
Yeah, that really sums it up. We wanted a brand name that was not easily interpreted. So we started from that point, and then something that you could build on, but that was abstract in a sense. So we always sought to do that. One of my business partners, Graz, I've got two business partners, Graz Benny and Jill Brown, who founded Van Brown. Graz is of Italian origin and her partner is an artist. So she had a natural interest particularly in Renaissance art herself. I was always fascinated by the city-states of Italy, the way that they played a role in the birth of capitalism, I suppose, as we know it. And as you say, rightly, the way that Florence used soft power was really interesting. I've been reading about it recently, actually, in terms of just the sheer number of people that were culturally or politically influential that actually emerged from that period. I think that was a real inspiration to us. And then we also wanted to make a statement about we were looking for a different way of approaching what we did, a third way, if you like, of approaching what we did. And we talk about that often in terms of how we try to bridge the divides that exist in the sector between things like corporate and consumer PR. So there was an aspect of that within the Third City name and ethos. And yeah, as I say, it was to give us a founding story that would inspire us.
So soft power is so fascinating and really interesting. The whole story behind Third City. A lot of people look at the UK as being really good on the world stage for soft power. It doesn't have the economic and military might that it had, 100 years ago, but it does have a lot of influence. And often in the soft power index, it ranks really high in the top three. What would you say is, having sort of studied medieval sort of Renaissance and Florence, and being a Brit, what would you say are the reasons why the UK is so good at influence on the world stage, at soft power, and the fact that as a small country we have such an outsized share of voice in terms of global media? I mean, we've got the FT, the Economist, the Times, the Guardian, the Daily Mail, and when you think of other countries that have that many sort of global media houses, you really struggle and you realize how special our media sector is. So I'd love to pick your brains about why you think the UK is so good at soft power.
Interesting. I actually studied hard in soft power. I don't know if you've read Joseph Nye's book on soft power when I was doing my master's. So it was something I was quite interested in, and the different perspectives on that they exist in American politics. Obviously, the Democrats tend to be more associated with soft power, and the Republicans more with the sort of use of hard power. I do believe in a political sense, I believe that hard power is the thing that rules. So in that sense, I'm a realist. I don't necessarily believe that you can sort of affect, let's say, the level of actual change that you want without hard power. So I do think that's an essential sort of component of geopolitics. In terms of the UK's position, obviously we're privileged by the bad things that we've done as a country. I would say obviously there are good aspects of what we are and what we represent as a country as well. But obviously the imperial past that we have has given us certain institutions which are and remain powerful. Hopefully we are turning some of those institutions towards achieving good things. And obviously the media would be a key part of that. I would say the other key asset that the UK has got is London. It's a truly global city. I think sometimes at the cost of other parts of the country. I don't necessarily think that London's preeminence in the UK is a complete good thing. But at the same time, I would say it's a really important part of the way that the country sort of reaches out and builds its, I suppose, brand, if you like. So just in terms of talking about what Britain stands for globally, the nations are brands. In fact, I think there's quite an interesting relationship between the way the nation states develop and then corporately the way that brands become important, because nations serve the same role as brands in the sense that they're a shortcut for people to think about bigger ideas that might underlie them. And obviously the UK is interesting in that sense. And it's interesting in terms of cultural power. I think we've been very good at taking cultural products from other places and reinterpreting them. So, I mean, the Beatles would be a prime example of that. The Rolling Stones, in the music sense or in the cultural sense, what they basically did was they took American music, black music from America, and they repurposed it and then sold it back to America again, in a way that I think culturally America would have found it hard to do. And I think as a country, because we are an island, because we are quite associated with trade, services, and things like that, we've often borrowed and sort of reinterpreted cultures and other things. And I think that's one of the things that makes us so powerful, and from a soft power perspective. And also one of the best things about us as a country is the way that we can actually integrate others into our national brand, if you like.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, I've traveled extensively for work, and I just think the UK is really special in being able to be a great convener of the world, and then that brings ideas and talent, and that lends itself to our soft power. Now, back to Third City. Now, interesting sort of like, sort of the naming, the ethos, the philosophy about sort of soft power and influence. What I wanted to understand is when you set up Third City with your co-founders, were you focused on particular sectors and services, and have they changed over the years?
Yeah, so when we launched, we made a conscious decision that we didn't want to serve a specific sector. And I think that served us really well in terms of the way that the agency's grown, because obviously I'm a believer that you can take and should take learnings from one sector into another. So we made a conscious decision not to do that. Obviously, as with every decision you make, there are positives to that, and then also it can present challenges. Obviously, if you're a generalist, that means that you have to compete against specialists. Sometimes specialists may be better than in those sectors than others. Then in terms of services as well, I would certainly say we didn't seek to be a generalist. We did look and have always looked to strike a middle way in terms of thinking about audiences. So the industry was very much split when we launched into consumer boutique agencies, very creative, tending to report into CMOs, very much in the marketing communication space, and then reputation and public affairs corporate agencies, again, who tended to look at the functioning of business and reputation, but were less interested in brands. And we very much tried to bring those things together. And there are a lot of trends that are going on in the market that have helped us in terms of that. Obviously, the rise of social media and digital, and then more recently, the advent of sustainability itself, because sustainability has both a consumer audience, an internal audience, a stakeholder and investor audience. It's a very hard thing to deliver just in one silo. And I think that's why, as well as enjoying the work, that's one of the reasons that we have very much gravitated towards doing sustainability comms as a really important part of what we offer as an agency.
And with Third City, obviously culture is so important because it's ultimately, the business is about people. How would you describe the culture for Third City? And also, I wanted to sort of just pick on the thread of remote versus hybrid, because so many people are sort of having those conversations at the moment about, what is the optimal structure?
So yeah, sort of two separate questions there, I think. In terms of what we stand for culturally, I think we've always sought to not be too hierarchical, to place an emphasis on sort of self-actualization, in personal growth, in not necessarily thinking about yourself relative to others, but actually thinking about, okay, how can I grow for myself and the goals that I want to achieve? But clearly we're humans and everyone is going to compare themselves with others. And obviously as an agency, you will also compare yourself with others as well. But we would seek to encourage people to think about personal growth and growth as an agency rather than growth in comparison. That's an important part of our culture. We've also, I think, always, I hope, enabled people to have a good work-life balance. And that feeds into the other point you've made around hybrid working. Again, like a lot of agencies, we have had to think and experiment a lot. We were well equipped for COVID because we did a lot of flexible working and hybrid and digital working already because of the nature of the teams and the nature of the clients that we were working for. So it was quite natural for us to sort of flip a switch into the total virtual working that you had at the beginning of COVID. But I also believe that let's say you developed a certain amount of social capital, and that social capital was almost sucked out in those sort of 1 to 2 years. And I think, as with many agencies, that became total virtual working became a struggle, and you had to then look for, okay, what's the solution? How can we make this work? We tried and thought about it a lot and tried lots of different blends of home working versus in office working. You want to encourage collaboration. you also want to give people the lifestyle benefits that they and the well-being benefits that they get from working from home and from hybrid working. It's something that I personally have really benefited from. I don't think I could or would have even considered moving out of London if it hadn't actually been for COVID and the realization that other ways of looking at things are possible. In terms of where we've landed up with the hybrid piece, we came to believe and understand that you need a home. I think that's really important for an agency. If you don't have a physical home, i.e. an office, which you own, which has your name above the door, where you own the lease, I think that can be really challenging, because if your staff are only going to have a relationship with you where they're on Zoom and they're working virtually and then they're moving from place to place, I think that can become challenging in terms of, well, what's your employer brand versus someone else's? Why would people come to you? So we believe that having home was really important. So we have a lease, we have an office. It's in a great location, central London. It's really near to Farringdon Tube. You can get everywhere. You can get to the city. You can get to Soho. And I think that works really well for everyone. We've also landed on 3 dedicated days in the office, which I think a lot of others have as well. So we do Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, I think, as I've already said, where we encourage all of the team to come in for collaborative working. And those days have a different character, I think, to the other days, the shoulder days in the week, which are Mondays and Fridays. And then in terms of how we make hybrid working work for us, it's about the sensible use of technology as well. So we were always using Zoom and Google Hangouts sort of for quite a long time before the COVID period. But since then, we've introduced things like dedicated CRM system we use across the company. We are increasingly experimenting with AI platforms where and when they help people with productivity. And we have tried to give people, enable people to have the technology that allows them to move around. So, I mean, they're all fairly obvious things, but obviously they're all things that require sort of action and decision making. And there is always a lot of experimentation in terms of working out what works for you. But I think in the past year, particularly since we've moved to our latest office, I think we found a really good equilibrium as a company. I think people maintain a really good work-life balance, but obviously we do work hard.
That's fantastic. And, Third City, they win a lot of awards and, you're well known in the industry. What I wanted to ask is, what would you say would make the sort of typical quintessential Third City client?
That's a really interesting question, actually. I think so. In terms of the way that we approach our business and our strategy for growth, we have 4 key growth pillars. So the first one of those is fintech. So financial services has always been an area where we had a lot of experience. Most of us, between us, we'd worked for most of the big retail banks before we actually launched the company. And obviously when we launched, we then coincided with a VC boom, with the emergence of lots of interesting fintech models. So I think we're one of the most well-known agencies in that space. Our client list includes people like ClearPay, Rakuten, big Japanese company now in the UK. And most recently, we launched Zing, which is the international payments app that is backed by HSBC, going up against the likes of Revolut and Wise. And then in the past, as I say, we've worked for all sorts of different fintechs. I think the other thing I point to is some of the work that we've done with Starling. I think Starling Bank, although we don't work with them now, we had a 5-year relationship with them. And we did some really interesting work that really was characteristically Third City, in the sense that it was blending consumer creativity with constructing a corporate message and raising the profile of their leadership, and Bowden, particularly the unusually a female CEO of a bank here in the UK. We created Make Money Equal, which was a really interesting brand platform for them. And that was a platform that really hit both investors, stakeholders, the political world, but also the mass consumer. And obviously, we've been really pleased to see the success that Starling Bank's become and to have played a role in that. So sorry, I digress. But so that's fintech. Fascinating space. The UK is a real global leader in that space. I think it's one area where you can say we absolutely are a global leader. There's a lot of investment and money that goes into it, and we're a real hub for innovation. The second pillar we talk about is social good. And this encompasses our work in government. So we work with a number of government departments on behaviour change campaigns. We work with also charities, and increasingly charities these days are taking on the role of government in terms of trying to achieve societal outcomes. And the S aspect of ESG is something that is really important to us as an agency. So, for instance, we work with the National Fostering Group, which is the sort of biggest fostering agency working with local authorities all across the UK to actually encourage parents to foster. We've done some big campaign. We recently did a campaign with them profiling foster carers with the photographer Rankin, working with Fatima Whitbread, who grew up in care, to sort of promote the incredible role that foster carers are playing. And then we're working on behaviour change across other clients and also outside of government in the healthcare sector with clients like Zava. And actually today, look out, we've just launched our Pay Your Pension Some Attention campaign with Gemma Collins, which is a major campaign working with the Association of British Insurers and a group of different insurers and companies across the industry to actually promote the really important issue of pension saving. And again, that's a campaign which encompasses stakeholder comms, working with charities, working with people in the civil society space, but also a really creative mass engagement campaign using integrated digital channels, using influencers, using earned media. So again, that I think along with styling would be a very classic third city client, the kind of client that wants to look at the big picture across all the different audiences. I'm nearly finished on the pillars. The third one is what we call progressive brands. So we, as an agency, obviously sustainability is important to us in terms of the work that we do. We are a B Corp, and we've always been committed, I think, to thinking active progressively. We don't work for clients in sectors that we believe are destructive socially or environmentally. And we have always, I think, attracted lifestyle brands across the piece, not just sort of technology and tech brands and services, but also increasingly FMCG. We work in the automotive EV sector a lot. We work in the energy sector. And when we talk about progressive brands, that's people who want to excite mass audiences, be those SMEs or be those consumers about their brands. And then the final pillar is ESG and sustainability. So we don't seek to be a sustainability management consultancy, if you like, but rather we are focused on sustainability communications. And sometimes that means pure sustainability comms briefs. So for instance, we work with Nespresso on a brief that is just about recycling, but also cross-selling sustainability to all of our clients is a really important area of growth for us. And also looking at where are the areas where behavior change and communications can actually make a real difference to the energy transition. And again, ESG and sustainability as a pillar is something a bit like digital that really crosses over the three other areas that I've talked about. But those are our main areas for growth. And hopefully I've given you an idea of the kind of clients that we're really proud of.
Yeah, and I think it's what I wanted to ask with these four pillars. Did you create these sort of growth pillars before or after you achieved B Corp status?
It was really after. We had a big exercise 2 or 3 years ago in and around thinking about, okay, what do we stand for as an agency and what are the trends that are happening? That's where we came up with our proposition. You'll see from our website, Comms for a New Economy. Comms for a New Economy is about serving businesses and the business models of the future. And the reason that we like it is because it doesn't confine us to just doing consumer marcoms work and working with CMOs, although obviously that is something that excites us and we really enjoy, or working with reputation and communications people or indeed CEOs. It allows us to do both of those things. We characterize our clients in terms of what they're trying to achieve. They are part of the new economy. They're part of the sectors of the future. So we started with Comms for a New Economy, and then we thought, okay, strategy is about sacrifice to a degree. What are the areas that where we think we're strongest and where we think we can grow? And that's how we came up with those 4 pillars. So that's really, as a strategy, as you say, you don't have to necessarily have expressed or written down a strategy for it to be a strategy, but that was specifically written down 2 or 3 years ago.
And do you feel that B Corp has added value because the process is quite long and arduous and it's not easy to get the certification? So in hindsight, do you see there to be sort of tangible benefits from going through the process and getting the accreditation?
I think B Corp is really valuable. I think it's important as a differentiator. Many agencies now have B Corp certification. So although it's hard to achieve, if you, in terms of its value as a selling point to clients, I would say that is not as strong as it was. I would also say that we were pretty early. We weren't the first, but we first started seeking B Corp accreditation in 2018. And as you say, there's a lot of people that want to achieve it. So there was a queue, and it took us quite some time to get there. But now we've got there. We're really proud of the score that we achieved, and we're actually at the moment in the reaccreditation process for B Corp as well. So I'd say as a differentiator, obviously, if everyone's got the mark, then it becomes less valuable as a differentiator. It's really important for us in terms of recruitment. It's really important for us in terms of reassuring, I think, clients that we will work in a certain way and that we are committed to ethical behavior in our own supply chains. That's really important, I think, not just for clients who are buying your services, but procurement departments and other areas like that. I think that is really helpful. But actually, I think the reason B Corp is most useful is because it reminds you to think about the things that you go around telling other people that they have to think about. And I would say that that is probably the most important reason to get it. You should get it for its own sake and for what it gives you, and then maybe think about what the marketing benefits of it are.
And I think coupled with, I think recently Third City was named ESG Consultancy of the Year by PR Moment. I think the positioning of your agency is becoming increasingly clear in the market. And then that helps to then recruit the right people who share the same passion and mindset. So it becomes this sort of positive sort of cycle where you get the right clients aligned with your values as well as the right talent. And that's where the magic comes in, when the talent and the clients are aligned. Now, I wanted to talk about boards, because you're on several boards, so including the Free School in Kilburn, trustee of the National Association of Child Contact Centre, visiting lecturer at University of the Arts. For those people who are sort of thinking, my God, there's so much work involved in juggling, the sort of the day job and family. Why would you advocate for people who are already stretched quite thin to go and volunteer?
I think I've actually taken a step back from volunteering since I've had a child. I wanted to dedicate more time to being a father, and obviously to the company as well. And I found that my time was very stretched. However, I would really recommend, I learned a lot from the trusteeships and the charities I work with. So I was initially involved with a school that actually just opened on my road where I lived in Kilburn at the time. And they were looking for volunteers. And I said, okay, well, at that time I was doing a lot of work in the education sector. I'd actually been a school governor as well in Deptford, where I'd lived previously. So I had a bit of experience, and I was looking for a way to, without wanting to sound too wordy, to make some kind of contribution to my local community. So I got involved, and obviously with those kinds of things, one thing leads to another, and before you know it, you're doing 30 hours a week. So I would say, as you'll know, Farzana, because of the amount of voluntary commitments that you have, obviously you want to do a good job. And we sort of grew the school. We took it through its Ofsted. Obviously it opened. It was a completely new free school. So it was about opening it to the community, encouraging people to come in, making political connections and things like that. So I found all of that work really, really interesting. It was absolutely fascinating. There's a lot of issues to manage in education, but I found I did it for 3 years. And once the Ofsted was finished, my son was born. So I decided to sort of take a step back from doing that. But I would absolutely, school governors are something that we really need. It's something that you can make a real tangible difference. And I'd actually encourage people, many people go into it just because they're parents. I am not a school governor now, but I am a parent. But when I was a school governor, I wasn't a parent. And actually, I think just going into it, I would encourage people to think about going into it, even if they don't have children in that school. And in some ways, the separation gives you a better ability to do a good job. I also work with the NAC, the National Association of Child Contact Centres, and that was all about the social impact of marital breakdown. And you realise when you get into an issue like that, just what a huge impact that has, particularly in terms of just the trauma that it causes. NAC operates hundreds of child contact centres all over the country. A lot of people who fall out, divorce, separate, they can't reconcile. And that is really difficult for children. And NAC does an amazing job in terms of creating safe spaces to bring those people together in an environment, I think, because most of their funding came from the Ministry of Justice, in an environment where, and that's one of the areas which has had, as we know from the news at the moment, just this morning, has had the absolute most swinging cuts over the last 10 years. It's not an area that's prioritised at all. So that was really challenging and interesting, and that was really helping them to think about how they could raise money, because it was, how do we keep these contact centres open? So that was more, and they're absolutely thriving now as well. But I think that was bringing knowledge of brand and fundraising, I think. So slightly different from the schools piece. And then the University of the Arts, to be honest, I've done a couple of lectures there. They kindly invited me to do those. It's obviously really interesting to talk to students, particularly MA students. But I think with all of those things, there are things that I've taken out of that and put into the workplace. So volunteering does create really invaluable opportunities to network. And because you genuinely are doing something, giving up your own time, that means people will respect that. And I found that really helpful and really interesting. And then in terms of place, I think particularly if you live in London, I find the same here, living in Brighton, a relatively big city. It's hard to feel a connection with your community. We are so transient in big cities. And I think it's really important to look for a way, whatever that is, to actually make a connection with the people around you and try to expose yourself. I talk about lifelong learning. Try to expose yourself by learning from people that you wouldn't necessarily reach in your bubble, because our bubbles have just become so closed, particularly in the last few years. And I think that's really important to try and reach out beyond that. So I would encourage, particularly if your only commitment is work, I would say that, time commitment is work. I would say that volunteering is really going to add to that. So sorry, that was a long diatribe, but I hope that's helpful for people.
Yeah, I think so, because it's also very practical. And, ultimately it's about, if you want to volunteer, it's really about looking at your sort of life through many seasons. And there'll be seasons where you'll be in the rush hour of your life with, caring for elderly parents, young children, a full-time sort of gig. And that perhaps may not be the best time. And, and I think it's sort of understanding that you don't have to have your foot down on the accelerator on all aspects that you want to achieve in your life, figure out the right time. So I think very, very practical advice. Now, obviously, you've been in PR for a very long time. You have the vantage point of really looking at trends and understanding them within a sort of a historical sort of context. I think it's been 15 years in the industry or longer?
I've been doing this for nearly 30 years.
Oh my God.
I started when I was 20. I'm nearly 50 now. So, yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it has been a long time. Now, What I wanted to know is, from your perspective, over 30 years, what have you, how have you seen the PR industry evolve from when you originally started, 30 years ago? That's quite a broad question, but just like top line major shifts that you've seen.
The number one thing is the changing nature of the media. But I would say that digital and social media, the industry that they've most disrupted is journalism. And I think the emphasis when I went into PR was very much just on earned media and journalists. And it's now moved away from that. And media is obviously still an important part of what we do. Relationships with journalists is still important. But the role of a journalist and the nature of journalism has just changed so fundamentally. That also then leads into the blurring of categories. I think when I started working, advertising had a status that I'm not sure it has now, rightly or wrongly, because there's been so much blurring between digital, other forms of marketing, and also between earned and known media. So I suppose the not decline of advertising, but the metamorphosis of advertising and the reaching of lots of other different disciplines into that area, the blending of disciplines is also another really important part of it. The other thing we've seen is, and again, it is to do with media change, is a change in not just our outlook as consumers, but actually in terms of the way that our minds work. So again, when I started working, people respected institutions in a way that they just don't. And those institutions included journalism, and for good reason, because of the events that have happened in the last 20 to 25 years. People have just lost a lot of that trust. We all talk a lot about declining trust in our industry. It is vitally important. and particularly important in the way that it's driving polarization. And polarization is worsened or increased by the way that we consume media now as well. Again, I talk about trying to reach outside the bubble that you're in, trying to disassociate things necessarily from your identity or your feeling. I'm in an in-group or an out-group, and trying to think about things more objectively becomes really, really hard as you get bombarded with more and more information. There's no one there to intermediate, and there are fewer institutions that we trust to do that now. So those are the biggest changes I think we've seen in the last 30 years. Then I'd say in the last 5 years, in fact, even maybe the last 2 years, obviously we're looking at another huge leap in terms of digital transformation with AI. I think journalism has almost been disrupted as much as it can be disrupted. And I think it now may be time for professional services to be disrupted. And that is something that's really going to affect us. And obviously we have to take advantages of what it does for us in terms of productivity, but then also think about, okay, what are the long-term consequences of this in a way that maybe we didn't think about what the longer-term consequences of Facebook or the rise of the smartphone might have been in 2008. I think we sort of naively embrace technology, and I think we should learn from that and try to think about, okay, how can we use all these tools productively so that society still functions as it should? So that would be another major change that's happened, I suppose, in the last 5 years. And then I think we've seen, I talk about media weakening. Media has weakened, media brands have weakened, but I think what's really encouraging now is that we're seeing really strong media brands emerge, and I think people gravitate back towards them. One of the things that I've really tried to do in the last 2 to 3 years is to support proper journalism. So that means, for instance, I'm a subscriber to the Argus, my local paper here in Brighton, because you've seen how important regional newspapers are, and actually how much they've declined and how few people they can just employ.
Yeah.
And I think local media is really, really important. And then you've got emergent brands. Obviously, some of them existed already, but have really built themselves up as having business models that really work, like the FT, like the Athletic would be a great example in the sports sector as well. And I think so. A resurgent and stronger media is, I think, something really positive that's going on. But clearly, there are a lot of challenges in terms of media business models. And actually, in PR, we sometimes feel perhaps a weaker media might present us with an opportunity, but it also creates a real challenge for us. If there's weak media, then it's hard to change behavior because people just don't believe what they read. And we need to try to move beyond that, or try to think of new ways that we can get around that.
Having experienced so many shifts and changes over the last 3 decades, you obviously understand that change is the only constant in this industry and, quite frankly, in life. How do you consciously go about thinking and future-proofing Third City, or is it something that, when you start seeing shifts and changes, you look for solutions? Do you carve out time for the co-founders to really think through, actually, these are the future opportunities and risks. This is how, as an agency, we can navigate it. How do you approach future-proofing?
So we don't, obviously, now we've been going for 15 years. My business partners we're all 15 years older than we were. And we're really lucky. We've got a great leadership team, and we have equity partners as well within the agency. So it's about trying to involve everyone in more of a structured planning process. One of the things that I've come to value, which I didn't really value, I think because of the way that I saw things and the way that my career was early, which was a bit random, was that I never really valued structure and process. And I've come to see structure and process as really vitally important, although I'm not necessarily a particularly structured or process-driven person myself. I value it in a way that I didn't. We have a much a revised or more structured planning process within the agency in terms of thinking about what are our commercial targets, in terms of revisiting our strategy, making sure that it's future-proofed. We have working groups around things like artificial intelligence to think about how can we integrate that into our work and the work that we do. But clearly, you're also responding to what goes on. The good news is, working in PR, obviously, we do have our eye always on what's going on in the news and what's happening. So I think in that sense, we can be quite attuned to what's coming around the corner. But obviously, our competitors are the same, and we have a lot of competitors. So you've got to keep up with them as well. So, yeah, we do take a structured approach, and we try not to just to respond, but actually to think about what might be happening. And actually, I think examples like B Corp accreditation quite early, the use of technology that we've got in the agency, the way that we've exploited that. I think they're all examples, I hope, of how we view things progressively and try to think about the future.
Fantastic. So, Mark, I wanted to just close out with some quick fire questions. So, who is the communicator that you admire the most?
So, as I say, I'm interested in American politics. So obviously, I'm going to choose American politicians. So my two heroes are FDR and Obama in terms of just pure communication ability. I think in terms of if you assess the presidencies, there might be a more mixed picture, but I think they're both absolutely remarkable in terms of the way that they were able to use communication to actually shift sort of generational divides in the way that people think. I also really admire the sort of universalist approach. It's started to look a little bit old-fashioned as identity politics has become more and more important. But I do believe and really espouse this idea that we should celebrate what we share. And I think they would both be great examples of that. In the business world, I come up with an example. This is harder, but in terms of the tech CEOs, I think someone who really flies under the radar is Dara Khosrowshahi, the CEO of Uber, who was previously the CEO of Expedia. I know of him because my wife worked at Expedia, so I know she had great admiration for him. I think he's a tech CEO, more of a managerial approach, I suppose, than an entrepreneurial approach. He's got an absolutely fascinating backstory as an Iranian emigre. But if you look at what he's done at Uber, one of the reasons that he's a successful communicator is that he's kept Uber, I think, out of the news. He's made it feel like a stable company and a professionally run company. And I think he's an absolutely consummate communicator, and anyone that works for him will tell you that. So he's someone that I really admire, I think, in the business world. And then in the sports world, I was trying to think about who I liked as a communicator. I really like football. I'm interested in football, possibly over-intellectualizing football a little bit. I'm one of those people. But I was thinking about football managers that I most like. Obviously, I think Mourinho is a great communicator, but I love Guardiola in terms of his motivational style. I don't know whether he's as brilliant a communicator with the media. He's not a manipulator, but he's a motivational communicator. And obviously, if you watch the documentaries that are about him, I know football isn't really your thing. But if you watch the documentaries, you can see how he really brings that energy across, the energy to people that make people want to work for him. I think he's absolutely brilliant. So he's someone that I really admire too.
I'll look him up. Now, thinkers. What thinkers have had the most impact on you? Authors, poets, philosophers, podcast hosts?
Okay, so authors. So I did study English literature. So my favorite, I'm very much into modernism. So my favorite writer is F. Scott Fitzgerald. Also, there's a theme of American studies coming in here as well. And my favorite poet's T.S. Eliot. And my favorite painter is probably Picasso, although I do also really love Caravaggio. So, and then actually in terms of other authors, I am quite a Spanophile. Hispanophile, I think is the word. So I'm very interested in South America. I'm very interested in Spanish culture. So I'm a big fan of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, magic realism as well. So because I'm quite into modernism, I don't know a huge amount about philosophy. I've studied it a bit, but clearly the most influential philosophers in terms of those movements would be Nietzsche, Kierkegaard and others, but I won't pretend that I'm a great expert in that. But you did ask about philosophers, so I'll say that. In terms of podcasts, This is a bit more prosaic. I am a really avid consumer of podcasts. So, and my favorite categories are obviously politics and sport, as I think it's probably come across already. I would point everyone to Adam Tooze, the Columbia economic historian. His podcast, it's called Ones and Twos. It's absolutely brilliant. I recommend anyone who works in PR to listen to it, because every episode, he will speak about a different subject. But he has a perspective both as someone who has a really deep knowledge of economics. He wrote a brilliant history, which I think is in the bookcase over there, Crash, the history of the financial crisis. He also made his name as a historian of the economics of the Third Reich. But now he's just a real polymath, and he can just talk about any subject, giving a historical perspective and also an economic perspective. Absolutely love him. And I love the Albanian philosopher Leah Ipi as well. She's written a brilliant book about her past growing up in Albania, She's an expert on cans as well. So she's the person to listen to if you want to know about content and philosophy as well. But her book is absolutely brilliant about her life as well. So I'd certainly recommend that to people. Then in terms of sport, I've really been enjoying, you had Mehreen Khan on a few weeks ago, and I've been listening to her podcast with Simon Cooper. Simon Cooper's just brilliant. He intellectualizes football and makes it an anthropological study, and that's just something I absolutely love. I know a lot of people I'd roll their eyes about that, but they have a podcast called Heroes and Humans of Football, and they talk about all the figures in football and actually analyze them intellectually, psychologically, and all those things. I find that really entertaining and really enjoy that. So that would be another one. And then the king of podcasts is David Runciman. So I would send anyone, he's a professor at Cambridge, but he does different podcasts, educational and around philosophy. He's done a history of ideas. He also, at the moment, he's doing a series of podcasts on counterfactuals. His podcast is called Past, Present, Future. So I would definitely recommend people go there as well. That's a regular listen for me on my runs every week.
Fantastic. My God, I feel so ignorant. Half of those I have no idea about. So I'm going to start Googling. Now, career advice. What career advice would you give to your younger self? Imagine 30 years ago, first day in PR.
I thought of two things. Don't worry what other people think about you. I don't think successful entrepreneurs do, but that's something that you have to learn. And the other one would be don't make the same mistake twice. It's really important to make mistakes. You have to make them, but then you must learn from them. Those would be my two things.
I like that. How do you stay sane? Any mental health well-being hacks?
As you get older, like I am, I'm nearly 50, I've started to put a much greater emphasis on physical well-being and its relation to mental well-being. I think my generation engaged in too much self-destructive behavior around things like working patterns, around things like the use of alcohol. And I really admire the way actually that the younger generation take their well-being so much more seriously and actually are able to set boundaries as well in a way that I don't think that we did. I think that's something that's really important. It's something that I've learned from younger people and that I'm really working on in my life, minimizing or trying to cut out alcohol, maximizing the amount of sleep I get. And then the two big areas they say as you get into your late 50s, you should concentrate on are VO2 max and lean muscle mass. So VO2 max means aerobic exercise, getting your heart rate up to as high as it can go at least once or twice a week. And then muscle is basically, I've started doing weight training, not something that I ever thought about doing, but I'm reading a lot about how that's really important. And then hearing aids, apparently, to ward off old age, apparently there's a lot of medical evidence that you should pay attention to your hearing and your sight and actually act on those things as early as possible in terms of getting glasses and hearing aids and things like that. So that's been something that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of my well-being. So I take those things quite seriously because I need the energy to do what I do. And you only have that energy by thinking about yourself, I think, in that way.
I agree. I have a huge admiration for the younger generations, how they just have a no-nonsense approach. And they've got really strong boundaries as well. So I feel very inspired by them. Now, if anybody would like to reach out to you, what would you advise? Your LinkedIn, your company website? What's your preferred method?
I think people can actually email me, mark@thirdcity.co.uk. And LinkedIn, I will also look at. I don't think I'll look at anything else. I would have said Twitter a few years ago, but I wouldn't look at it now. I don't think so. Don't try and reach me there.
Fair enough. So thank you, Mark, for such a fascinating conversation and for sharing with our community. And thank you for listening. You'll find this episode on the PRCA's YouTube channel and Spotify and Apple Podcasts alongside other episodes. If you like what you hear, please do share so we can grow our community. If you have any feedback or topics you'd like us to cover, please do contact us. We publish interviews every 2 weeks, so please stay tuned as we have some more inspiring stories in the pipeline.